So day 5, we're going to finish up. This is our last lesson before the dreaded midterm. It always sounds really scary, by the way. Again, that's just what we call it. It's a midterm because it's the middle of the class. It's not actually the middle of your program. It's not actually like worth 90% of your grades. It's nothing like that. But it's just another, it's sort of like an extended piece of homework. It's 30 questions. It kind of goes back and reviews everything so that we don't ever leave the past behind, at least in terms of knowledge. So we are going to be kind of working our way through all of this today in the nervous and muscular systems, which we call the neuromuscular system when they're working together. And we'll talk about the role of the central nervous system, how it actually works when it comes to human movement. We'll also be talking about the peripheral nervous system. Those are the two primary divisions. When we're looking at the nervous system, is another classic example of like how scientists love to get things down to 2. We love to get things into 2 categories. So you've got the central and peripheral sides of your nervous system. The central system makes the decisions. The peripheral system carries out those decisions, but also gets information to the central system. And then we'll talk a little bit about how like neuromuscular junctions work. That's kind of fun. The neuromuscular junction is where like a neuron's fingers would come down and sort of insert into this little gap, and then that little gap would be the start of a muscle cell, and that's how your nervous system and your muscular system communicate together. Basically your neurons zap your muscles and your muscles go and then they contract. And then we'll talk a little bit about the organizational makeup of skeletal muscles today. We are going to take a look at a muscle in the exterior, like as it looks anatomically, but then we're going to really zoom in and we're going to get into the individual sort of microanatomy of muscle cells, talk about the steps in muscular contractions, and understand the different types of muscle fibers that are out there. Because those are basically the areas that NASA wants you to know and you get tested on and stuff. So looking at it, when we're talking about like human movement, right? All of that is going to be under the control of your nervous system. Like one of the things we talk a lot about is we mentioned the kinetic chain all the time, right? And we're not going to spend too much time talking about the kinetic chain in this class because we're kind of skipping the skeletal system. But the kinetic chain is actually 3 systems working together. It's your skeletal system, which gives you a framework. It's your muscular system, which actually moves that framework. And it's your nervous system, which controls the movement of that framework, right? So like your nervous system is going to control everything, sort of the head honcho inside your body. In fact, it's so important that it is the #1 thing that your body will try to preserve if you ever end up like in a starvation situation. The first thing that you will, sort of start losing is any of your stored energy, right? And that's in the shape of your body fat, right? But let's say you run out of body fat and your body's like, well, now what do? I got to, get calories from somewhere else. Your body will try, your body will try everything in its power to preserve your nervous system because that's controlling you. So what it'll do is it'll probably start tapping into your muscle mass and eating that next. It might even tap into your bone mass for nutrients. So it'll try its hardest to preserve your nervous system. That's how important it is, right? So when muscles contract, they contract because of what we call, and it's always so fun to have to actually say, an excitation contraction coupling. It's just like a lot of hard consonants there. And basically what excitation contraction coupling is, and this is a term that you don't have to use with your clients too often, is excitation is like where, your nervous system is sort of, exciting something else, right? Like, you picture like, I don't know if any of you guys have cats or grew up with cats, but, I used to have a cat that, would be napping. And she was really friendly, but like if you woke her up from a nap, she would turn around and she was like, I'll kill you, like, and so like, she sits there kind of dormant, and then you go up to her and you're like, and she's like, that's an excitation, right? Like it's sort of stimulating something else, right? So in the nervous system, it's like the nervous system exciting maybe another neuron or a gland, or in this case, muscles, right? And so then that causes like a contraction. So there's a coupling that's taking place. There's a a synergistic action between like your nervous system and your muscular system. And so if you have like some type of injury that involves your central nervous system or maybe your peripheral nervous system, it's going to interrupt the communication of information. Now, this is not an injury, but if you are, let's actually, David, I know that you have this habit because we talked about this. If you tuck one leg under your body while you're sitting, right? Let's say like you're sitting down and you're like tucking your left leg underneath and like then you're sitting nice and upright, right? Like I'm doing that right now, right? If I sit like this long enough, eventually my foot's gonna fall asleep, right? And you might be thinking like, and probably somebody has said this to you before. They'll say like, oh, you're like, oh, no, my foot's asleep. And you're like, and you feel that kind of tingling sensation, so a lot of people think that it's like, oh, you cut off the blood flow to your leg. Like you hear people say it all the time. It's like, oh, you cut off the blood flow to your leg. And so now your foot's, complaining because it has no blood flow. Here's the thing, guys. If that were true, you would lose your leg. You do not want to fully cut off blood flow to any tissue. If you cut off the blood flow to a tissue and then tissue doesn't get oxygen delivery, those tissues die permanently. So when your foot falls asleep, it's not because you cut off your blood flow. Actually, what you're doing, you've interrupted the nervous system's signal to that muscle. It's kind of like an injury in your peripheral nervous system. So you are pinching a part of your peripheral nervous system, which again, remember the peripheral nervous system is in charge of gathering information and getting it to the central system. And it's responsible for carrying out any of the actions that the central system says. So you've either interrupted the messengers coming in or you've interrupted the messengers that are coming back out, right? And so then your foot starts sending a signal. It starts pinging back to the brain, and then your brain is trying to ping a signal back to the foot saying like, hey, foot, are you still down there? And your foot's like, hey, brain, I haven't heard from you in a while, and it's just pinging back and forth. And so, what you don't realize is that your brain is constantly doing that 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. But now because you've pinched the signal closed, they start sending really big signals like, hey, foot, and your nervous system is screaming, but you don't know it because you've pinched the signal off, right? It's not getting anywhere. So then all of a sudden you shift in your chair, you change your body position, and all of a sudden, all of those signals, that screaming is getting to your foot, and you're like, oh my God, and you're starting to feel your foot has fallen asleep, and you're like, and it feels like, somebody described it once and I thought this was so brilliant. It feels like what static on the TV sounds like. Your TV's like, right? So that's actually what's happening when your foot falls asleep. You've interrupted the neuromuscular signal. Your nervous system can no longer communicate with the muscular system, which can no longer communicate with the nervous system, right? It kind of goes back and forth. And so they're both just screaming at each other. And eventually the signal gets through. And unfortunately, you have to feel the effects of all of that screaming. And then eventually it kind of calms down just a few seconds later. That is the whole section there. Simon, did you have a question, by the way? I saw your thing light up, but it didn't come off mute.
Oh no, it's just I was gonna like finish your sentence about the TV static feeling.
Oh, yeah, right.
With it, and I was just like, oh, I know that part.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, so I heard somebody say that and I was like, oh, I'm gonna remember that forever. That's really, really accurate. So when we talk about like the idea of like human movement, right? Normally we talk about the entire kinetic chain, like your muscular system moving your skeletal system under the control of your nervous system. And if any of those, links in the chain, if any of those systems are messed up, you break a bone, you tear a muscle, you interrupt the nervous system signal somehow. Or, if you just use a muscle too often, it starts to get like really overeager. We call that overactive. and then your nervous system is just contracting that muscle 24 hours a day, it starts to mess up the chain. You've got a weak link in the chain. And that's why we kind of talk about it. Like one affects both of the others at any given time. But today we're just going to really spend our time talking about the nervous and the muscular system. So human movement, which is what we're all concerned with, is just a complex series of steps that starts with your central nervous system deciding, to move some body part, right, specifically. So we're going to go ahead and dive into this in just a second. I've got two videos I want to show you today because we're kind of putting them together. So we're going to go with go. Not that one, that one. So we're going to go ahead and start with a little tour of the nervous system here. Again, we got some really great animations here that are going to kind of explain how our neurons work and stuff. So we're going to steal Hank again. We got two videos today that we're actually going to watch, but here we go.
I'm going to be totally honest with you. I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about my bodily functions, for the most part. Maybe sometimes. But in the next few episodes, I'm going to be talking about all of the organ systems that make our lives possible, even occasionally pleasant. And to start it all off, I'm going to go straight to mission control, the nervous system. Pretty much every single animal, except for some really simple ones, have nervous systems, which is great because it's what lets things do things, like have behaviors. It makes you the sentient living thing that you are. The whole setup here, your brain, your nerves, your spinal cord, everything is made up of specialized cells that you don't find anywhere else in the body. Most of those are neurons, which you've seen them before. They look kind of like a tree with the roots and the trunk and the branches. Neurons bundle together to form nerves, pathways that transmit electrochemical signals from one part of your body to another. So when you bite into a piece of pizza, I love it when there's pizza in the videos. The receptor neurons in my taste buds recognize I'm eating something salty and fatty and awesome, and they carry that information along a nerve pathway to my brain. And then my brain can be like, yeah, pizza! And then it can respond by sending back information through different nerve pathways that say, you should eat more of that pizza. And despite what my brain is telling me, I'm going to try to not eat any more of that pizza. You wouldn't think that it's terribly complicated to know that pizza tastes good and to tell someone to eat more pizza, but it turns out that our brains and our nervous systems are crazy complicated. Your nervous system basically has a big old bureaucracy of neurons, and it's divided into two main departments: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Central and peripheral. The central nervous system, basically your brain and your spinal cord, is responsible for analyzing and interpreting all of those data that your peripheral nervous system, all of the nerves outside of your brain and spine, collects and sends its way. Once the central nervous system makes a decision about data, it sends a signal back through to the peripheral nervous system saying, do this thing, which the peripheral nervous system then does. Both of these systems contain two different types of neurons: afferent and efferent. Afferent and efferent are biological terms, and they're horribly confusing, and I apologize on behalf of the entire institution of biology for them. Afferent systems carry things to a central point, and efferent systems carry things away from a central point. So afferent neurons carry information to the brain and spinal cord for analysis. In the peripheral nervous system, afferent neurons are called sensory neurons, and they're activated by external stimuli, like the complex and glorious flavor of pizza, and then they convert those data into a signal for the central nervous system to process. The central nervous system has afferent neurons too, and there they bring information into special parts of the brain, like the part of the brain that goes salty. Efferent neurons carry information out of the center. In the peripheral nervous system, they're called motor neurons because many of them carry information from the brain or the spinal cord to muscles to make us move, but they also go to pretty much every other organ in your body, thus making them work and do stuff to keep you alive. In the central system, efferent neurons carry information from special parts of the brain to other parts of the brain or spinal cord. Of course, if it ended there, it would be way too simple, and no good bureaucracy has just two departments. So the peripheral nervous system is actually made up of two different systems with two very different jobs: the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic system controls all the stuff you think about doing, like all the information coming through your senses and the movement of your body that it makes when you want it to make movements. But here's something interesting. Since we're totally in love with our brains as sort of of the center of all being of ourselves, we think that all the information about everything going on in our bodies goes to our brains for some kind of decision. Not so! Sometimes, like when we touch a hot stove, the afferent neurons carry the signal hot to the central nervous system, but that information doesn't even ever get to the brain. The spinal cord actually makes that decision before it gets to the brain, sends a message directly back to the muscles saying, "Get your hand off the freaking stove!" This bit of fancy nerve work lets the spinal cord make decisions rather than the brain, and it's called the reflex loop. So the other branch of the peripheral nervous system, the autonomic system, carries signals from the central nervous system that drive all of the things that your body does without thinking about them. Your heartbeat, your digestion, breathing, saliva production, all of your organ functions. But we're not done yet here. We need to go deeper. The autonomic nervous system has two divisions of its own, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And the jobs that these two perform aren't just different, they're completely opposite. And frankly, they're always vying for control of the body in some kind of nervous system cage match. The sympathetic division is responsible for, freaking out. You've probably heard this talked about as the fight or flight response. In other words, stress. But stress isn't all bad, it's what saves our lives when we're being chased by saber-toothed tigers, right? The sympathetic system prepares our body for action by increasing the heart rate and the blood pressure, enhancing our sense of smell, dilating the pupils, activating our adrenal cortex to make adrenaline, shutting down blood supply to our digestive and reproductive system so that there'll be more blood available for our lungs and our muscles when we have to, run! And even though you're not in a constant state of panic, at least I hope not. I kind of am. That system is running all the time, every day. But right next to it is the parasympathetic division, working hard to make sure we take it nice and easy, dials down the heart rate and the blood pressure, constricts our lungs, makes our nose run, increases blood flow to our reproductive junk, our mouths produce saliva, encourage us to poop and pee. That's basically what we have to thank for taking a nap, sitting in front of the TV, going to the bathroom, and getting it on. So consider yourself lucky you got both the stress response and the chill the heck out response working side by side, because together they create a balance, or a homeostasis. Now, that's what the nervous system does. Next, we have to talk about how it does it. The neurons that make up our nervous systems make it possible for our bodies to have their very own little electric systems. So to understand how they work, you have to understand their anatomy. Like I've said before, a typical neuron has branches like a tree. These are called dendrites, and they receive information from other neurons. Neurons also have a single axon, the trunk of the tree, which is branched at the end and transmits signals to other neurons. The axon is also covered in a fatty material called myelin, which acts as insulation. But the myelin sheath isn't continuous. There are these little bits of exposed neuron along the axon, which have the sweetest names in this whole episode. They're called the nodes of Ranvier, which seems like an excellent working title for the 8th Harry Potter novel, Harry Potter and the Nodes of Ranvier. Anyway, these nodes allow signals to hop from node to node, which lets the signal travel down a nerve faster. This node hopping, by the way, has a name. It's called saltatory conduction. Conduction because it's electrical conduction, and saltatory because saltatory means leaping. Finally, the place where an axon's branches come in contact with the next cell's dendrite is called a synapse, and that's where neurotransmitters pass information from one neuron to the next. Now, think back to, or just go watch the episode that we did on cell membranes, where we talked about how materials travel down concentration gradients. Well, in much the same way, all of the neurons in your body have a membrane potential, a difference in voltage or electrical charge between the inside and the outside of the membrane. You might also remember that this buildup of voltage is handled in part by a sexy little protein called the sodium-potassium pump. Basically, the pump creates a voltage differential like charging a battery by moving 3 positively charged sodium ions out for every 2 potassium ions it lets in, creating a net negative charge inside the cell relative to the outside. When a neuron is inactive, this is called its resting potential, about -70 millivolts. But in addition to the pumps, neurons also have ion channels. These are proteins that straddle the membrane, but they're a lot simpler and don't need ATP to power them. Each cell can have more than 300 different kinds of ion channels, each tailored to accept a specific ion. Now don't zone out here, because all of this stuff is going to come into play when a neuron becomes active. This happens when an input or stimulus creates a change in the neuron that eventually reaches the axon, creating what's called an action potential, a brief event where the electrical potential of a cell rapidly rises and falls. When an action potential begins, like when a molecule of sugar touches one of my sweet taste buds, some ion channels open and let those positive sodium ions rush in so that the inside starts to become less negative. With enough stimulus, the internal chart of the neuron reaches a certain threshold, which triggers more sodium channels to respond and open the floodgates to let even more ions in. That's happening on one tiny little area of the neuron, but this change in voltage creeps over to the sodium channels, which are also sensitive to voltage, and so they open. That exchange triggers the next batch, and so on down the line. So the signal of changing voltage travels down the neuron's membrane like a wave. But remember, the myelin sheath insulates most of the neuron and just leaves those little nodes exposed. So instead of being a steady wave, the wave jumps from node to node, speeding up the travel time of action potential down a neuron. That's your saltatory conduction at work. When the wave reaches the end of the neuron, it triggers a release of neurotransmitters from the neuron through exocytosis, and those neurotransmitters then float across the synapse to the next neuron, where they trigger another action potential over there. Now by this time, so many sodium ions have gotten inside the first neuron that the difference between the outside and the inside is actually reversed. The inside is positive and the outside is negative, and it seems like neurons hate that more than pretty much anything else. So it fixes itself. The sodium channels close and the potassium channels open up. Positive potassium ions rush down both the concentration and electrochemical gradients the cell. That brings the charge inside the cell back down to negative on the inside and positive on the outside. Notice though that now the sodium is on the inside of the cell and the potassium is on the outside, in the opposite places of where they started, so the sodium-potassium pumps get back to work, burn up some ATP to pump the sodium back out and the potassium back in. And whew, things are now back at the resting potential again. So that, my friends, is how action potential allows neurons to communicate signals down a whole chain of neurons from the outer reaches of the peripheral nervous system all the way up the spinal cord into the brain and then back out again. So let's zoom out. Look at the broad view here. I'm gonna take a bite of this pizza. All of my taste buds have neurons in them. Each of my taste buds contains between 50 to 100 specialized taste receptor neurons. Chemicals from this beautiful pizza dissolve in the saliva and then stimulate the dendrites on the afferent neurons. This generates a bunch of action potentials that travel from the afferent neurons in my tongue all the way to my brain, which is like, my goodness, I think that's pizza. Let's have another bite. The brain then sends messages through the efferent nerve pathways to do all sorts of things. 1, chew, which involves constricting the muscles in my jaw over and over again. 2, lower my head down to catch another bite, which involves moving all kinds of neck muscles. 3, swallowing, which involves constricting the muscles in my throat and esophagus. 4, opening my mouth again to receive another bite. That signal is also going to my jaw. And that's not even to mention what's going to go on with the digestion of this bad boy driven by the autonomic nervous system. But digestion is still a couple of episodes now. Hopefully, there will be more pizza. Thank you for watching this episode of Crash Course, and for giving
We don't
me
exactly
an
do
excuse
these
to eat more pizza. If
videos
you
in
want
the
to
right
review
order.
what we learned in this episode, check out the table of contents.
So obviously there's a lot going on in that video, but we're going to try to make it as clear as we can tonight. Again, you might or tonight. It's the morning. So you know, there is a lot going on whenever your nervous system creates a signal, right? And you'll notice like stuff was moving from one side of the cell to the other, right? It was on the outside, then it moved to the inside, then it moved back to the outside, right? And again, this kind of goes back to the conversation that we've been having this entire time, right? It goes down to what we call a concentration gradient, right? So one of the reasons your body needs to produce energy, like we've also been sort of keying up the idea that we're going to be talking a lot about energy production in the second half of this class, right? We need to produce lots and lots and lots of energy in our body. The reason we need to do that is because we've got little pumps inside of our cells that are actually going to pump sodium and potassium ions. Those are your electrolytes, by the way. That's what sodium and potassium are. They're electrolytes. So when you get like a Gatorade, it has sodium citrate in it, and then some potassium. And so like those ingredients actually flood you with electrolytes. It makes it easier for your muscles to contract because it makes it easier for your neurons to create this electrochemical signal. So when you have like sodium here and potassium here and you flip them and you rub them back and forth kind of like this, right? It is kind of like your socks on carpet. you're rubbing your socks back and forth and you generate, and then you touch a doorknob and you're like, mother, you know, like, that is, you know, you zap yourself. You created static electricity. Well, this is chemical electricity. We call it an electrochemical signal. And it's from moving sodium and potassium backwards. God dang it, I just remembered. I don't have it. I used to keep a little battery powered thing here because it was the easiest. Do I have batteries? I used to keep 2 batteries. I must have harvested. I used to keep 2 batteries in my desk, but you know, oh, all right, hold on. I got a visual aid here. So this is what's happening in your body, right? Like I got these 2 batteries right here, right? Now, if you look at them, right, notice how they're both facing the same way. I mean, these are little AAAs, but like, so they're kind of hard to see. But see how like both of the negative ends are over here, both the positive ends are over here. A little knobby bit is on this side, a little flat bit's on this side. Like if I put this in a remote control, nothing's gonna happen, right? Like it just doesn't work. It doesn't do anything, right? But if I go like this and I flip one of them, and now I've got the positive end here and the negative end here, and on the other one I got the positive end here and the negative end here, right? Now that they're flipped like that and they're facing different directions, that is going to create electricity because the chemicals in the battery are flipping these electrons back and forth. And so then my remote control can capture that electricity from the batteries, right? And that's how your car works. If you know, that's how your car battery works. That's how you know, my Christmas lights that I have to take down today. That's how those work. You know, that's what you're doing. You're moving not sodium and potassium in this case, but like you're moving ions that are positively and negatively charged back and forth. Okay, so your nervous system needs to be able to do that. It needs to be able to move sodium and potassium back and forth and rub them back and forth so that it creates a little bit of this electricity. And that's how your nervous system communicates. So we have to push sodium and potassium into places they don't really want to go, right? Like they're nice and happy on one side of the cell, and these guys are nice and happy on the other side. So because we're sort of moving these things sort of against nature's will, you know, it's like moving against gravity. Like when you walk up a hill, right? It takes more effort. It takes energy to get you up that hill. Well, in order to push sodium and potassium in the opposite directions of where they want to be, we have to have a specialized shaped pump. That's what you were seeing in the video with like the little things rushing in, and then it would squeeze this way and it would squeeze this way, right? That's all pump. And it takes a little bit of energy in order for that to happen. So we create energy in our neurons thanks to us bringing in, you know, carbohydrates, and thanks to us bringing in oxygen and things like that. We spit out a little bit of ATP. That's our version of energy, right? We spit out some energy, and then it pumps sodium and potassium against their concentration gradients. And then all of a sudden, because there's way more out here and way less out here, there isn't, you know, the electrons are like, no, I want to get back to the other side. So all of this electricity gets created and it runs down, and then it happens here, and it happens here, and it happens here, and it happens here. Like take a look at how an action potential looks. You know, there's the positive and the negative sides of everything. That's not quite what I want. Positive, negative, membrane. Let's try that. There it is. Okay, so you take a look at this picture right here. This is the outside of the cell, and this is the inside of the cell. And see how this is positive and this is negative. And what's going to happen is these are going to flip. This is going to be positive here. This is going to be negative here. It's like a battery, you know, being flipped. Like right now, this cell is at rest. It's at its resting potential. So both of the sides of the battery are facing the same way. But then we're going to flip one of them, and all of a sudden a little bit of electricity is going to get generated. And then nature is going to flip it back. But you know what's going to happen? As soon as nature flips that one back, we're going to burn up a little bit more energy, and we're going to flip the next one. And then we're going to flip the next battery. And then we're going to flip it again. And we're going to work its way all the way from, and it's going to be, you know, it's going to be flipping constantly all the way down. And that's how an action potential travels from our brain down the tail of a neuron to the next neuron, to the next neuron, to the next neuron, till eventually it meets your muscle. And then that electricity is going to run across your muscle. And that is going to cause contractions. That's going to cause your muscle to jump. This is also why if you've ever electrocuted yourself, you're like, God, you know, you contract really hard. Same exact thing that's happening there. You ran electricity. My dad would always tell me this when I was a kid. Actually, David, you might know a little bit about this. I don't. My dad didn't teach me much about electrical engineering because he doesn't know much about electrical engineering. But he would always tell me this as a kid. He would be like, look, you know, if you're messing with an outlet and you plug your finger into a 110 outlet, that's your regular old house outlet, right? You're going to have a bad time. It's going to hurt, you know, and it's going to go thunk and you're like, ah, you know. And I did that when I was a little kid. I accidentally I put my thumb, I was like 3 and my mom asked me to plug in this vacuum cleaner. I put my thumb on it and I like plugged in. I was like, and you know, that was really bad. But my dad would always tell me, is like, but a 220 volt or amp or whatever socket, which is like the type that your washer and your dryer go into. He's like, if you ever grab that and touch that, you're not going to be able to let go. And that's going to be it. Is what he would always tell me. Because like what he meant was, and you know, he doesn't know this, but what he meant was that like you'll start contracting, your muscles will start contracting, and they'll literally contract so hard that you'll spasm and you can't let go. At least that's what he would always tell me. Doesn't quite work that way, but it is kind of, you know, that's one of the things about electricity. You want to remember, it creates muscular contraction. I mean, think about like when you're watching a medical drama, they got those paddles and they're like, clear, and like they zap somebody and like, you know, their chest jumps off the table. It's not usually that dramatic, but it is contractions that are taking place because of the electrochemical signals. So let's go ahead and work our way through it, right? So that is, again, we're kind of looking at these concentration gradients, right? A lot of sodium here, a lot of potassium there. We pump it against the directions it wants to go, which nature hates and wants to move it back. That creates electricity, and then it flows back to normal. And then we pump it against the direction it wants to go. And we're just flipping it back and forth, rubbing our socks on the carpet, and creating a little bit of electricity. So as we're looking at this, you know, movement is a series of very complex, you know, pieces that are taking place in our nervous system so that it can act with our muscular system, right? We want this to contract specific parts of our nervous system. This is why we divide our nervous system into a couple different sections for us to understand, right? We need to divide our muscle or our nervous system into the central system, which is responsible for processing information and making decisions, and the peripheral system, which is going to gather information going towards the brain. Those are called sensory neurons, and also respond to the information coming from the brain. Those are called motor neurons, right? So let's say like I placed my hand down and I left my stove on, right? And I accidentally placed my hand on a hot stove, right? First thing that's going to happen is I'm going to jerk my hand away. Second thing that's going to happen is the house is going to get a little bit louder and a little bit more profane. But we'll just go ahead and take a look at the moving of the hand away, right? So what's going to happen is information is going to go from my peripheral nervous system in my sensory neurons. My sensory neurons are going to send information up, right? Your sensory neurons sense information. They sense physical changes, right? Or maybe even chemical changes, right? And so that information is going to go up to my brain, and my brain's going to go, huh, well, if we touch something that's hot, chances are we're going to lose some of our skin. That's not good. We should move the hand away, right? Like, and so then the information is going to travel back down motor neurons, and it will contract the appropriate muscles for me to move my hand. In this case, it's probably going to be my bicep and my rotator cuff, and I'm going to pull my arm back like this, right? And that is sort of how the nervous system is organized, right? The sensory neurons, which are part of your peripheral system, get information to your brain, And then your motor neurons, which are actually also part of your peripheral system, go away from the brain back to whatever muscle it is they're contracting. Right. So your central system is your brain and your spinal cord, and then all of the nerves and tracts and things like that that are running around your body. Those are all parts of your peripheral nervous system, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at the brain here really quick. Like I said, this gets a little bit more, I said this earlier, Alexa, I'm not sure you heard me, but this gets a little bit more technical than we need it to. This PowerPoint gets a little overly detailed for my taste. So I actually don't have anything in your notes for this first section because it's not stuff that you're ever tested on. It is kind of fun though. So we'll kind of work our way through it pretty quickly. So let's take a look at how your brain is sort of organized, right? So you got this section called your precentral gyrus, right? And it's located in the front and the center of what is called your sulcus. You can actually see this right over here. It's right in this section right here, right? And that front part of your brain, obviously your brain doesn't actually work like this, but I always like to think of it as like, this is where everything starts and then it kind of works its way to the back of your brain, right? In fact, like, you know, when you're communicating with someone and like human beings, we're not that great at communicating. You know, we get into arguments over the silliest stuff all the time. You know, someone will say something and then you'll hear it and you'll go, are they talking about my mom? You know, and you get offended, right? That is very much the front fight or flight part of your brain. Before you get to the back part of your brain, that's like, oh no, what they were referring to is, you know, where we really kind of figure it out later. But sometimes before that happens, we say something that we're going to regret. And now all of a sudden we're, you know, in a fight and we're arguing about whose turn it is to do the dishes. So that's sort of how your brain works. It starts in the front and kind of works its way back. You know, and eventually it gets to the very end in the back where you get to your primary motor cortex, okay? And that is the section that actually travels down and deals with your muscular system, right? So all these neurons that we're talking about, right? Your precentral gyrus will get some information, then it'll send it to the back of the brain, and the brain will go, oh, got it. This is the appropriate neuromuscular response. And obviously, the more you do this kind of stuff, the better you get at it. You know, that's what's kind of fun about your nervous system. The more you reinforce things, the more you do them, practice sort of makes perfect, right? Is what they say. And that's like, you know, it's like hitting a baseball, right? You know, which is arguably, what do people say? They say it's the hardest thing in sports, right? And so like you get used to it, you know, and you're like, no, you're pivoting your back leg too much, or no, you're not twisting your body at the right time. You work with your batting coach. And you get better and better and better and more accurate at it, right? You start to develop your hand-eye coordination, right? And that's because your nervous system is being continually exposed to this stuff. And it's learning how to work with your muscles to move your body in response to things the way that we're really trying to intend it to move, or at least in the most efficient way possible. Now, obviously, all of this takes a massive amount of energy, right? In order to kind of power the nervous system to create those electric signals, in order to contract our muscles, you know, both of those things are going to require a lot of energy. And so luckily, we have these really great molecules of ATP. We've got a lot of adenosine triphosphate, right? That's that little high energy molecule. I'm just going to draw one of these as fast as I can, you know, with a molecule of adenosine there, and then 3 little phosphates that are attached to it, right? And so those little phosphates are all kind of tied together and attached to our ATP molecule here. And what we're going to do is we're going to kick off that 3rd phosphate. We kick it off and that releases a whole bunch of energy, right? So we need to be able to create a lot of ATP all the time. This is the jankiest picture I've ever drawn. We need to be able to create a lot of ATP. So during a contraction, your ATP will break down. It will kick off that third phosphate, leaving you with two phosphates. So now we're going to call it ADP for adenosine diphosphate, which is sort of the wreckage of an old ATP molecule, right? It's what's left. Now, if your body wants to be able to create energy again, if it wants to be able to create energy again, one of the things it can do is it can actually reattach that phosphate. It can just go ahead and drag that right back over and reattach it, and then it is able to break it off again and re-release some energy, right? So that's kind of cool, right? We're really good at, breaking and using energy. So the primary function of ATP is to produce muscular contractions, right? And all of your actions and everything that we do, right? We need to generate ATP. And so in a way, our nervous system tells our muscular system when to break off ATP molecules, which allow it to release that energy, capture that energy, and do all of our stuff, right? And that's how we actually move on, right? Again, you can start to see why it's so important for us to understand, how we respirate and how we bring in, digestive foods and stuff. All of that food energy gets broken down into energy to make us work. It takes trillions of ATP molecules to power your body, and that is a really big number, So here's the various areas of the brain. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you can see these little areas in red here, 1, 2, 3, 4, like your Broca and your premotor cortex and your primary motor cortex. All of that is associated with movement. So these sections of the brain are really responsible for like doing all the stuff, right? And then you've got all these areas in blue, right? You got the primary auditory cortex. That's the one that's allowing you to hear things when you're like, huh, right? You've got your sensory cortex over here. That's really experiencing like most of the sensations that come in when you touch that hot stove and you're like, mother trucker, I can say that, by the way, because my mom is a mother trucker. And then you've got your primary visual cortex, which is, responding to like visual information, which is kind of cool, right? Like when you see different wavelengths of light, that's helping you interpret colors and stuff. Anybody in here colorblind? Do you have anybody who's colorblind in class? Nope. Okay. I had a really fun moment in school years and years and years ago, where our teacher pulled this up when he was describing neurons, and he pulled up this little picture right here. So this is a colorblind test, and it's kind of hard to see, but you should be able to see numbers in the center of these circles. And he was talking about how like the different colors and the different wavelengths are kind of coming into your brain, and your brain's using sensory, and it's getting sensory information, and it's burning up energy to kind of interpret that information, right? And I thought that was really cool. I was like, oh, that's a really practical lesson. And he's like, this happens in your muscles, it happens in your nose, it happens in your taste buds, like, it's happening all over your body all the time. And I thought that was a really cool, like relevant lesson. But then there was a moment where we were all like, oh yeah, you can, because they are kind of hard to see, right? Like I think that this number 6 here is particularly difficult to see. And you might be like, I don't know, I can see it really clearly. And that's how we know like our colors are, slightly different. Each of us in this call right now, we're probably seeing things just a little bit different. Our blues are still our blues, but they're maybe a little bit off. But we were all like, oh yeah, you can see the 6, you can see the, and this one kid in class is like, what are you guys talking about? I don't see any numbers. And we were all like, what? Like, and this kid, he went, he was like 19 years old. He had no idea he was colorblind. He had gone his whole life, interpreting, his shades of gray as colors. Like he knew what red was, he knew what green was, but they were like his versions that were sort of like a kind of a dull gray, and he couldn't tell the difference between like really close colors, and he didn't know he was colorblind. He found out in class, and we were like, it like blew our mind. And I've always like, I always tell that story whenever I'm talking about like the different hemispheres of the brain. His brain was the same. That's what's interesting. Like his brain, it's not your brain that makes you colorblind. The difference was the cones in his actual eyeballs were in, the neurons in his eyes were not sending the same information to his brain. That's the difference between colorblind. So kind of fun there. Let's get out of the brain. Let's finish this up here real quick and get back into muscles. So you've got your cerebrum. That's the really big part of your brain. It's divided into two major hemispheres, your right brain and your left brain. And they are all of that's going to be responsible for regulating sensory information and motor skills, right? So like sensory information comes in and then like motor information goes out. And at first you're probably pretty clunky at this stuff, like when I was a kid, I had a really bad habit of chewing my nails. And so my parents were like, we got to find some type of habit to replace that. And so my dad taught me, you guys ever do this? Like the 3 snap thing. My dad taught me how to do that. And he was like, anytime you start to get that nervous energy, just do this. And that was a huge mistake because then I walked around doing this all day. And at first I was really clunky at it. I was like, I'd do it at an awkward time and stuff. But I got better and better and better and better at it the more I like practiced. And it was a really good way for me to kind of release my energy. And then that drove my parents crazy. So then they taught me how to whistle. And now I do that all day, which you guys have actually probably noticed because that habit really stuck and has never gone away. It drives my poor roommate crazy. But those are the different parts of your brain. Your brain gets good at doing these things. And because it's kind of good at doing those things, it wants to kind of do those things all the time, which is why you get your nervous energy and you're like, I need to chew my nails, I need to snap my fingers, I need to whistle, I need to do this, I need to do that, right? If you're a leg bouncer, right? Your brain's like, oh, I'm really good at contracting the muscles in my leg. And so it wants to bounce your leg up and down all day, So those are the various like hemispheres of the brain that are kind of controlling those actions. They help process information from motor output, and then they help send that information out. So you can see like, this is what's kind of cool. See how this is C5, C6, C7, C8, and then this is T1. What you're seeing here are nerves and tracts, right? So your nervous system actually kind of looks like this. Here's your nervous system sort of laid out. You can actually see it. Again, guys, if you ever get a chance to get tickets, go to the Bodies exhibit. It is amazing. It's really, really cool. And this is where they've actually taken someone's nervous system and they've laid it out for you to see. And you can see where it's branching out from these little terminals on the various parts of our spine, right? So this is your C6 vertebrae, C7, C8, and then there's your T1 vertebrae. So let's take a look at that in sort of a picture version.
Yo, that's a real skeleton?
No, that is a
No,
well,
right?
I guess this part, I guess that's the real spine. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, this is a real nervous system.
Dang.
Yeah. So the Bodies exhibit, they do, I think they call it plasticizing or something like that. But they literally like take, these are actual like bodies that people, when someone says they're donating their body to science, this is what they're talking about. I mean, a lot of times they're actually organ donors, but like this is like people who they literally harvested like their entire thing. It's amazing. Look at the lungs, right? Remember the 2 primary bronchi and then all the individual bronchioles? It looks kind of like that. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
But yeah, that is a real person's stuff. So then actually, you want to see a really cool one, guys? We're going to be talking about weight loss for the rest of this mod. Like at the end of the mod, we're going to get into our weight loss class. Bodies exhibit obese. Take a look at a side-by-side comparison of an obese person's body versus somebody with like a sort of a standard BMI. Drastically different, right? Crazy different looking. It's a lot of extra tissue, and a lot of times you're going to see you can see a lot of like, and then there's like a smoker's lung, you know. So anyway, it's amazing, guys. It comes through. They're on like they tour around the world. When they come through LA next time, get tickets. It's absolutely incredible. Change your life. But let's go ahead and take a look at and our nerves. Here's what this kind of looks like, right? When we don't lay the nervous system out the way we did there. So this is what your spinal discs look like from the top view, right? So you can see like this is like one of your vertebrae, right? I'm not sure which one this is supposed to be, but there's your vertebrae, and there's your spinal cord running through the center of it, right? And then nerves are going to branch out. You can see like little tiny neurons here. They're going to branch out, and then they're going to travel down these like large sections, right? And that's what a nerve is. It's a large bundling of neurons, right? And then there's going to be information that's going to come in as well, right? Like there's going to be what are called tracts that are going to work their way like back to the nervous system, and that's how information goes in and goes out. Is like a series of nerves and tracts. But if you look at all these branches, come on, where is I guess? But that's a friggin' that's shopping. I don't want shopping. I want the let's try this. Close. You can see there's a couple of them. I want like the one with the whole body. There we go. So here you can see, right? It's going to branch out from each of the individual vertebrae and travel throughout our entire body. And those are going to be controlling sort of different sections depending on, you know, where it is they're zapping, right? So like your cervical vertebrae controls, you know, a lot of the information in like your arms and upper back area, right? And that's where if you ever know somebody who's like a quadriplegic, right? They're paralyzed from the neck down. The reason why is because they've severed the connection to everything down here, but everything up here still is working just fine. That's kind of how the system works, right? The lower down you sort of sever the connection, the more you're going to lose control, you know, or the less stuff you're going to lose control over, right? When you know somebody who's paralyzed, they've severed the connection to maybe, let's say they're a paraplegic, right? They've severed the connection down here to their legs. It's very rare to see somebody who has damaged like their arms and not their legs because it travels downwards, right? So that is sort of this organ, what we're seeing here. There's the C5, that's the fifth neck vertebrae, the sixth one, the seventh one, the eighth one, and then your upper back thoracic vertebrae starts. And you can go T1 through 12, and then you would see your lumbar vertebrae after that. So those all kind of branch off from one another. And that's really the organization of your nervous system, right? When we're looking at that organization, that's how your nervous system is going to start interacting with your muscular system. And the muscular system is probably the thing that you guys are all waiting to talk about. That's sort of our favorite section here. But any questions on the nervous system before we sort of dive into the muscle stuff here? Any questions, comments, concerns? Other than, you know, hey, don't show me any more bodies exhibit stuff. They can be a little freaky to look at sometimes. Are we good? All right. So let's take a look at muscles here, right? So we're going to take a look at we're going to start by zooming in massively, right? So your nervous system is going to control your muscular system through a series of electric signals. We're going to call that an action potential, okay? Because it's like, always got, here's what's kind of fun. This is why they call it an action potential. It's because the energy is always stored up. There's a lot of potential to use it. But until like something touches you or until you decide to contract, it's just potential energy. It's not energy that we're using yet. It's potential energy, right? It's like, you know, I remember this is a weird analogy. I remember in like shop class, our teacher, Mr. Foss, would constantly yell at us for setting like, you know, lumber upright and like really tall, and he would always yell, too much potential energy. And what he meant was like when you stack it like this, it can fall. It's like wham, and it's going to probably hit somebody or knock something over. Whereas if you lay it on the ground, it has way less potential energy. It has less potential to cause destruction. And that's kind of what an action potential is, right? The energy's sitting within the neuron and it doesn't really become active until you touch something or until you decide to do something. And then all of a sudden you create an action. So an action potential is where you have the potential to create action through these electrochemical signals, right? And so an action potential is moving sodium from one side to the other and moving potassium from one side to the other and flipping the battery. And all of a sudden, the electric action potential happens. And this is, let's see here, action potential. Let's see if I can find a GIF of all of this. Well, there's Crash Course. Not quite what I'm looking for. There we go. See this right here, guys? See how all the positive stuff is on this side, negative stuff here? See how they're flipping? And it travels down, right? That is an action potential in action. You can see the negative aspect is just going to kind of run down from one side here, and the positive aspect, right? The battery, it's like flip a battery, flip a battery, flip a battery, flip a battery. That's how I like to think of it. So that is the action potential running down a neuron. Now, eventually, it's going to get to a muscle cell. And this is where the really cool stuff starts to happen. So inside your muscle, here's what a muscle cell looks like. Actually, you know what? Not muscle fiber. Let's look at a fascicle. Oh, nope, that was the picture I wanted. There it is. This is like my favorite one that I pull up every time. So here's an actual diagram of a muscle, right? So here's the overall muscle itself. That's like the, this, let's say this is your bicep, right? And it runs up here and it's got its tendon. It would insert onto your humerus there. Now you can see this muscle is a bundle. It's like this little thing here, right, is kind of bundled together with this one, and it's bundled together with this one. These little bundles right here, if we pulled one of those out, this is what we got right here. This is what's known as a fascicle, or fascicle, I think is how you're supposed to say it. But this is a fascicle right here. Now, what a fascicle is it's a whole bundling of several individual muscle cells. So this one right here is an individual muscle cell, and that's an individual muscle cell. So muscle cell, muscle cell, muscle cell, muscle cell, and they're all kind of bundled and wrapped together, right? So then if we pull one of those muscle cells out, you can see it's got all the characteristics you would see in any cell, right? There's the nucleus, right? That's the sort of brain decision maker. And then see those little like potato bugs, right? We'll zoom in even further. Right? See little potato bugs, right? There's the mitochondria, right? So those little mitochondria are producing energy for our little muscle cell here. Which obviously, muscles need a lot of energy. So, there's a lot of mitochondria. If this was a type 1 muscle fiber, there would be a ton of mitochondria. And if it's a type 2 muscle fiber, there's going to be a larger gap and a lot more fluid in this cell, but less mitochondria. And that would be really good at, big, powerful contractions. But this one here, let's say this is a lot of mitochondria. This is very good for endurance, And then look at the muscle cell. See how it's all got all these little dots here, all these little circles, right? Those are the ends of what we call a myofibril. Hello, everyone. My son says is the stomach. It looks like the stomach. That's funny. So you see all these like little rods that are kind of running throughout the muscle cell, right? Those little rods are what is known as a myofibril. Now, look at how the myofibril has these little lines on it, right? These little tiny lines. Well, let's look at what a myofibril looks like. So this is an individual myofibril right here, right? And if I move myself over here, right? So there's a myofibril, and then we zoom in on it right here. And do you guys see how it has like this little purple band right here and this little green band right here? Those are individual little itty bitty tiny proteins. And those little proteins actually bind together and then they pull in one direction, right? They actually kind of crawl over each other. They kind of go like this actually. and then it kind of like drags it this way, right? And it drags it from this end this way, and it drags it from this end this way. So the myofibril goes from being this long, and then it shortens to this long. That is happening in every myofibril, in every myofibril of a muscle cell, in all of the muscle cells, in all of the fascicles, in all of your muscles, whenever you contract. That's crazy, right? It's this like little bundle, it's this like little rod that has these little proteins on it, all bundled together with like a whole bunch of other rods and a whole bunch of other proteins, right? And that makes up the muscle cell. And then that cell is looped together with a whole bunch of other cells. And then that loop is called a fascicle, and that fascicle is bundled together. So it's a bundle of a bundle of a bundle of a bundle. And that is how contractions are actually taking place. This myofibril is what needs to be zapped. So electricity and neuron, you'll see what's called the neuromuscular junction. A neuron will actually sit into this little gap within your muscle cell, and you're seeing a myofibril right here. This looks very different than it did a second ago. Right, remember, oh shoot, I closed the myofibril bit. Where'd you go? There it is. This one. So there's the myofibril, right? Kind of looks like, we just kind of drew them as like little straight lines. Look at this version here. There's the purple rod, and then these little blue ones are actually, those are the green rods from this picture here, right? So the neuron is going to release its electricity, and then that electricity is going to run across this entire muscle cell, and that's going to cause these proteins to contract, and they're going to slide together like this. Okay, so obviously everything I'm describing right now is kind of hard to visualize. Let's check out another crash course video that is going to kind of show you the animations for how this actually sort of works, right? Muscles, not muscular system. Yeah, this one. Oh, it is muscular system.
Your side.
All right.
Gonna do the two-step, then cowboy boogie. Grab a sweetheart.
There. All right. Oh yeah, and he is going to do a little bit of like fake exercising in this video. It's bad. Don't pay any attention to his form. That should go without saying. But here we go. This is going to show you what muscle fibers actually look like zoomed really, really, really far in.
Well, hello there. You caught me while I was working out. Last time I was lifting weights doing a crash course episode. Also, the last time I was lifting weights, we were talking about how all of this is possible because of cellular respiration, the process our cells use to get and store energy from the food that we eat. Remember that? Good times. As it happens, a lot of what we learned then is also really helpful in understanding the organ system that we use to do our gun blasting and walking and fork and knife operating and parkour and playing Assassin's Creed and, you know, like moving around. I'm talking about your muscles, of course, and you wouldn't be able to move them without the help of that same molecule that your cells use to get all their jobs done. Good old adenosine triphosphate. Now, your muscles may be your body's most obvious moving parts, but as with all things that are truly worth learning about, this system is both way more complex and way more awesome than it first appears. Yeah. Why? Because of chemistry. When you think of muscles, your mind usually goes straight to the guns there, but you really have three different types of muscle in your body. You have the cardiac muscle, your heart muscle, which is different from all the sorts of muscle in your body, and then you have smooth muscle, which is responsible for carrying out most of your involuntary processes like pushing food through your digestive tract and pushing blood through your arteries, important stuff there. And then there's the muscles that you're most familiar with, the skeletal muscles. Your gluteus maximus, your masseter, which is, important for chewing your hot pockets, the abductor pollicis brevis, right at the base of your thumb, aka your video game muscles. That's important for the Assassin's Creed. Just some of the 640 skeletal muscles you have. Those muscles, like all of your muscles, are only good at two things: contracting to become shorter and relaxing back out to their resting length. That's all muscles do. They contract and they relax. Pretty amazing that you can make a ballerina out of that. If you were to peel back my skin and take a look at one of my muscles, please don't do that, but if you did, you'd see that it thickens in the middle at what's called the muscle belly, and then it tapers off on either end into a tendon. Tendons are made of fibrous proteins, mostly collagen, that connect the muscle to the bone. Just a side note, ligaments, similar to tendons, but instead they connect bones to other bones. These muscle-tendon combos stretch across one or more joints. In this case, it stretches across my elbow, so that one bone can move in relation to the other bone. So I just moved my arm, and now I'm moving my mouth, and I'm basically moving my whole body right now. And the question is, how am I doing this? How am I moving all of these things in all this sort of amazing fluid ways? How am I able to do that at all? Unfortunately, it's kind of complicated, but it's wonderful and amazing, so it will be worth it in the end. First, we need to understand the anatomy of a skeletal muscle, which includes many, many layers of long, thin strands. Think of one of your skeletal muscles as a rope. It's made of smaller ropes that are bundled together, and then those ropes are made of bundles of thread, and those threads are made of tiny, tiny filaments. This structure is what makes meat stringy, because after all, meat is just muscle. This chicken breast is, or was, the pectoralis major muscle of a chicken. It connected the bird's sternum or breastbone to the humerus in its wing, and sometimes I feel like chickens have bigger pecs than I do. This is crazy. When you peel this muscle apart, you see that it's really made up of layers of thin strings. These are muscle fascicles, and each fascicle is made up of lots and lots of smaller strands. These we can't see. They're called muscle fibers, and these are the actual muscle cells. Now, because muscle cells perform such a specialized job, they're not like your run-of-the-mill somatic cells. For starters, they each have multiple nuclei. That's because each muscle cell is actually formed by a bunch of cells, somewhat like stem cells called progenitor cells, fusing together. Muscle cells are basically just bundles of complex protein strands, and since nuclei are essential for the protein-making process, muscle cells need lots of nuclei to make all the protein they need. From here on, you'll notice, by the way, that a lot of the stuff I'm talking about starts with the prefix myo or sarco, from the Greek words for muscle or flesh, respectively. Whenever you see those terms in biology, you know you're probably in muscle country. For instance, those protein strands that I just mentioned that make up a muscle cell are called myofibrils, and each one is divided lengthwise into segments called sarcomeres. This is where the action happens, my friends, because it's the sarcomere that will actually do the contracting and relaxing to create the muscle movement. Each muscle cell has tens of thousands of these guys, and they all contract together to make you do stuff. And this contracting and relaxing occurs through this really cool and complex interaction between two different kinds of protein strands called myofilaments. One myofilament is the protein actin, which are skinny strands that attach to either one of the two ends of the sarcomere, and the other is myosin, which is thicker and studded with these little golf club-shaped knobs along it called heads. Inside a sarcomere, these proteins occur in layers, with a thick strand of myosin floating between several strands of actin. Just how many strands of actin depends on the muscle we're talking about. In this case, let's just say that there are 4, 2 sitting on top and 2 sitting on the bottom. Now, when the muscle cell is at rest, none of these strands are touching each other, but they really desperately want to. They're like middle school students at a formal dance. The myosin in particular wants nothing more than to reach its little heads up and do some heavy petting with the actin. The chemical dance that allows this to happen is one of the sexiest things that goes on in your body other than, like, sex. And it's known as the sliding filament model of muscle contraction, which reminds me of an interesting story. I mentioned last week that we didn't really have even a passing understanding of the human skeleton until the 1500s, which seems kind of tardy to the party to me, but that's nothing compared with this. We didn't figure out how muscles worked until 1954. In 1954, 2 teams of researchers independently discovered that the sliding filament model is how muscles contract. And as luck would have it, 2 of the 4 scientists who made this discovery were named Huxley. We've already discussed Thomas Henry Huxley, the father of comparative anatomy and Darwin's bulldog. Well, his grandkids were all awesome at something too, like Aldous Huxley, who wrote the novel Brave New World, Julian Huxley, who was central to the development of modern evolutionary theory, and Andrew Fielding Huxley. Andrew Huxley was a physiologist who, with colleague Rolf Niedergerk, set out to solve the muscle contracting mystery. Until the early 1950s, all we knew was that myofibrils were full of protein strands. At that time, most people thought that these strands simply changed shape and shortened, like how a spring recoils after it's been stretched out. And by the 1950s, we'd learned pretty much everything we could about muscle cells by using conventional microscopes. So Huxley and Niedergerk actually designed and built a new microscope, a tricked-out kind of interference microscope which uses two separate beams of light. And with that, they found that during contraction, some protein strands kept their length the same, while others around them contracted. But at the very same time, British biophysicist Gene Hansen and Hugh Esmore Huxley, an American biologist who had no relation to the famous British Huxleys, were using another newfangled tool, the electron microscope. Using that, they observed that muscle fiber was composed of thick and thin filaments, the myosin and the actin, and that the filaments were arranged in such a way that they could slide across each other to shorten the sarcomere. So in two separate papers, published the same day, in the same journal, two teams proposed that muscle contractions were caused by the movement of one protein over another. I guess an idea whose time had come. Except it's not that simple. To understand how the sliding filament model works, the first thing to keep in mind is that in addition to needing a bunch of protein, muscle cells need to make lots of ATP. ATP, you remember, creates the energy for almost everything your body does. Yes, that goes for muscle movement as well. Another thing to remember is that some proteins can change shape when they come into contact with certain ions. Like we've seen that with the sodium-potassium pumps, for instance. Those pumps are proteins that can accept sodium ions outside a cell, and then they change shape to release them inside a cell. And also, suddenly at the same time, they become able to accept potassium ions. These shape changers are how cells get a lot of the day-to-day job of living done. In a sarcomere, it's calcium ions that change the shape of some of the proteins so that the myosin can finally have its way and grope the actin strands all around it. Then it'll drag those actin strands toward each other, causing the sarcomere to contract. But when a muscle cell is at rest, there are a couple of things that keep this groping from happening. The first is a set of two proteins wrapped around the actin. They're called tropomyosin and troponin, and together they act as a kind of insulation. Let's just continue our middle school metaphor. They're the chaperones. They protect the actin from groping. At this point, each little head on the myosin strand has the wreckage of a spent ATP molecule stuck to it. That's ADP and a phosphate, and the energy from that broken ATP is already stored inside the head. So yeah, the myosin has a lot of pent-up frustration. Now, while the muscle cell is resting, it's preparing a stockpile of calcium ions that it will use as a trigger when it's go time. This is done by a specialized version of the smooth endoplasmic reticulum called the Sarcoplasmic Reticulum, or SR. It's wrapped around each sarcomere and it's studded with calcium pumps. These pumps are constantly burning up ATP to create a high concentration of calcium inside the SR. And of course, whenever you create a concentration gradient, you know it's going to get used. So now we're ready for a muscle contraction to start, but what starts it? Well, stimulus, of course, from a neuron. Muscles are activated by motor neurons, and each sarcomere has a motor neuron nearby. When a signal travels down the neuron to the neuron synapse with the muscle cell, it triggers the release of neurotransmitters, which in turn set off another action potential inside the muscle cell. That action potential continues along the muscle cell's membrane and then flows inside it along special folds in the membrane called T-tubules. When that signal reaches the SR inside the cell, bingo, the SR's channels open wide and let all those calcium ions diffuse down that concentration gradient. The calcium ions bind with one of the chaperones, the troponin, which causes the troponin to rotate around the actin and drag the tropomyosin out of the way, revealing all of those super hot binding sites on the actin. With our chaperones distracted, the myosin, it totally goes to town. It reaches all of those little tiny heads along its length to bind up with the actin, and the excitement of that long-awaited precious contact finally releases the energy that came from breaking that ATP molecule. This burst of energy causes the heads to suddenly bend toward the center of the sarcomere, pulling the actin strands together and shrinking the sarcomere. In millions of sarcomeres, in hundreds of thousands of muscle cells, this is what allows me to, lift my arms. You wouldn't think it would be so complicated. Now, in order for the contraction to stop, you're gonna have to tear those two proteins apart, because each myosin head is really comfortable here, snuggling with its beloved actin. So it'll take another passing ATP molecule to attach to the head, which breaks off one of the phosphates to release its energy as soon as they touch. That energy breaks the myosin's bond with the actin and lowers the head, leaving it alone and frustrated once more. So it's weird that the energy from the ATP is actually used to make the muscle relax. But in fact, that's why we get rigor mortis. When you're dead, there's no more ATP to make the muscle relax, and all the calcium ions diffuse out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, causing the muscles to enter their resting state, which is contracted. But you're not dead yet, so let's wrap this up. When the myosin and actin are being separated, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is hard at work pumping all of the calcium ions back inside it and storing them up for next time. That lets our chaperones come back. The troponin and the tropomyosin retake their positions around the actin strand, resets the sarcomere for the next impulse to come along. Chemistry makes it all possible, from blasting your guns to my awesome dance moves. Thank you for watching this episode of Crash Course Biology. If you want to go back and look at some stuff, because it was a confusing episode today, table of contents. And thanks to everyone who helped put this together. This one was a doozy, so thanks to our head writer, Blake DiPestino, and of course Amber, as always, for doing our amazing graphics. If you have any questions, please leave them down below in the comments, or get in touch with us on Facebook or Twitter. We will endeavor to answer you, as will all of those extraordinarily helpful people who are not affiliated with us at all, but are quite smart and helpful. So thank you to them, and we'll see you next time.
All right. So that is a lot of the inner working parts of how every muscle contraction takes place. Again, this has a direct impact on how we exercise, right? Like if you want to have larger muscles, you need to damage those proteins. You need to make sure that you tear them apart. That's what's kind of funny about the gym, right? A lot of people, it's like, oh, I'm building muscle while I'm in the gym. No, you're not. You are breaking down muscle while you're in the gym. You're building muscle while you're sleeping. You're building muscle when you're in the kitchen. Well, in your dining room, unless you're a parent, in which case you're probably eating in the kitchen. You know, like that is the difference, right? A lot of people think that you're building muscle. You are damaging your muscle. You're breaking it down so that you can build it back up. Now, if you want your muscles to be a lot bigger, you need to create a lot of that cellular damage, which means the best way to do it is probably to create as much lactic acid as you can and leave it in the muscle for as long as possible, because it's very acidic and it dissolves stuff kind of like your stomach acid does. Not as acidic, but you know, it's going to damage those proteins, eat them up. And then your nervous system, or I'm sorry, then your immune system is going to come in and go, wow, we need to make that stuff bigger. We need to make it more resistant to damage. You know, but if you want to get strong, you want to lift really heavy, well, then you need to train your nervous system to store up more of those sodium and potassium ions. You need to make sure that your neurons are thicker. You need to make sure that your nervous system can communicate with your muscular system. So like you need to lift really heavy. You need to take really long rest periods to make sure you're fully reset in between sets. And you need to make sure that you have plenty of energy available, which is going to mostly come from that resting. And then let's say you want to build up your endurance. Well, you need to make sure that you're exercising for like a really long duration so your body will create more mitochondria to spit out energy. And that'll burn up any lactic acid that you leave around. So if you're trying to build endurance, you're probably not going to get very large muscles, but you'll get very, long contracting muscles. So inside an individual muscle cell, like I said, you are going to find what are called myofilaments, okay? So myofilaments are little proteins. The big ones we talk about here are actin and myosin. Now, this is the simplest drawing, and I always really like this one here. This is kind of what myofilaments look like. You can see in the center, we got this really thick head here and here, right? This thick strand in the middle, right? That's called myosin. So you got a thick strand, you got a couple thick strands here in each individual myofibril. A myofibril is the rod that runs through a muscle cell. And there's a lot of them. Like every muscle cell has a whole bunch of myofibrils in it. A big muscle has lots of myofibrils. That's a very strong muscle. That's also very much responsible for strength. So what happens is that rod reaches up and grabs this little thin strand right here called the actin, okay? Here's another version of that you can see here, right? There's the really thin strand up here. This is actin, and here's the really thick strand with this big little, this like club head that can reach up and grab and it can stroke it this way. So what'll happen is, if we take this into paint here, what'll happen is you will be pulling this one this way, and then you're going to pull the other one this way. So that's what you're seeing here. You can see this little section where all these little proteins are crossing over one another. They're shortening. They're pulling towards their center. Okay. And that is how muscle contractions take place. So myofilaments are these specialized proteins that are able to bind to one another. Go back to the PowerPoint here for the first time in forever. Myofilaments are these specialized proteins that are able to bind to one another in order to create muscular contractions. You've got actin, which is the thin strand that has all these little binding sites on it. You've got myosin, which is the thick strand that has all these little club-like heads on it. Those heads bind to the binding sites, right? So if we go back to this picture here, right? This is actin, and these little blue ones, these are each a little binding site. And so this head is going to reach up and grab that binding site. Right, so we can see sort of a picture of what this looks like here in action, right? Oh, well, it was working. There we go, right? See how they're reaching up and they're grabbing and they're pulling the actin strands towards the center, right? And then you do have what are called troponin and tropomyosin. That's this little strand that lives right here. See this little like rope and then this little pink thing. Those are regulatory proteins. They block the binding sites to keep your muscular contractions from happening when you want to relax your muscle. When you're relaxing your muscle, the binding sites block, and that way contraction can't take place anymore, right? So those are the proteins that you need to be familiar with in case they ever ask you about it on your test and stuff. Actin is the thin strand with the binding sites. Myosin is the head that grabs the binding sites. And they probably want to ask you about troponin and tropomyosin, but those are the proteins that keep all this from happening. Now, this process that we're talking about right now, another term you want to be familiar with, all of this is called the sliding filament theory, or sometimes you'll hear people call it the sliding filament model. It's describing how this sliding action is occurring, right? See how, again, we go back to this little GIF here. This is sliding this way and this one's sliding this way. They are literally sliding across each other, right? That's the sliding filament theory, right? So we're seeing them contract, and it happens because ATP energy is broken down to release all of its energy. And when that energy releases, it triggers this contraction to take place. And all of that is under the control of motor neurons. Motor neurons, again, those are the neurons going away from the brain. So your brain decides, hey, I'm going to contract the biceps, right? And then that signal travels down a neuron to the next neuron, to the next neuron, to the next one, until eventually that motor neuron zaps a muscle cell and triggers the sliding filament theory to occur. That is that big complicated term I used earlier, the excitation contraction coupling. You are exciting a muscle with the neuron, causing it to contract, and then they're coupled together. They work as a team. So it describes where motor neurons innervate or zap muscle cells, right? And a muscle cell, I did put this definition down here just because sometimes this gets a little confusing, are referred to as muscle fibers. Okay, you'll hear the term muscle fiber instead of muscle cell, and they just call it that. It's just a fancy name for it because it has a bunch of, your muscle cells are filled with proteins, and because there's just so many different types of proteins, we give it a special name. We call it a fiber. So all that's going to happen, right? Thanks to motor nerves. Motor nerves are a term applied to the neurons that travel down and zap your muscles in order to produce a muscle contraction, right? So here's where all that's happening. Here's an overall muscle, right? There's a fascicle right there, right? We pull that out. Here's an individual muscle fiber here, right? And then we pull that out and there's a myofibril. Your muscle fibers are filled with myofibrils. And when we zoom in on a myofibril, we see the thin actin strand and the thick myosin strand. Myosin has a whole bunch of heads on. I know this picture I pulled up here kind of makes it look like there's only one little head for like a really long section. But there's a lot of heads, right? You can see we drew 6 heads, I guess, on each side here. But there's a lot. There's a whole lot. If you look at the PowerPoint, you can see they're just covered in little heads. And so that's allowing that contraction to take place. So in skeletal muscle, these contractions are taking place all, simultaneously, and they're happening throughout the various layers of your muscles. Now, they are, like I said, interacting with your nervous system. Your nervous system is controlling all of this, right? So a muscular contraction is when the nervous system interacts with the muscular system to create that excitation contraction coupling, right? So the nervous system triggers your muscular contractions, basically. Let's put that in so how does it do this? How does it zap it? It doesn't necessarily just use, I've been describing it as like using electricity, because honestly, electricity is very present during this whole process, but it actually uses chemicals. See these little like dots right here? These little pink circles, right? Those are neurotransmitters. So here's the very end of a neuron, and here's the very start of a muscle fiber, right? And both of them have mitochondria, right? You can see a little energy producer here, a little energy producer there. You actually notice there's more in the neuron than there are in the muscle. Again, neurons take a lot of energy to run. What they do is they release these little chemicals, right? These little pink chemicals, and those chemicals bind to the muscle. That's called a neurotransmitter. Okay. And that's actually how like one neuron interacts with another neuron, or how one neuron interacts with a muscle cell. It uses neurotransmitters. This neurotransmitter is a chemical that triggers physiologic events. Your taste buds use neurotransmitters. All of it uses neurotransmitters. The one we use in our muscles is known as acetylcholine. It's the one that's responsible for triggering that action potential. So that action potential, that electric signal, once it hits this, runs across the entire muscle. If we look at like the neuromuscular junction, if we look at like how this works, right? You can see those neurotransmitters, an electric action potential runs down a neuron until it gets to the very end, and then it's going to release neurotransmitters, little pink things, into the area. Oh, it's not going to finish it. These darn GIFs, they never quite go the full length I want them to. Show me the electricity. Oop, this one will do it. Nope. What about this one? There we go. That's kind of nice because it's zoomed out. So the electric signal runs down the neuron, hits the muscle, there it is, and it runs across the muscle cell. So that is an action potential happening in a neuron, which triggers an action potential to happen within a muscle cell. And that muscle cell is going to release a whole bunch of calcium into the area, right? So a whole bunch of calcium leaves the muscle fiber, it leaves the storage depots and enters into the muscle fiber. Now, when calcium goes in, you know what happens? Those little chaperones, remember we said like those little proteins that block the binding site, the little green strand here, the little pink strand here, right? Those are really attracted to calcium. So by flushing calcium into a muscle, those proteins move out of the way, and that is what exposes the binding sites. And again, it's under the control of your nervous system. So calcium is an important part of the muscular contraction because when it binds to troponin and tropomyosin, remember those are the chaperones up here, right? The regulatory proteins. It allows them to move out of the way, and that exposes the binding sites. And all of a sudden, myosin is like, it is on, and it gets all up in actin's business, right? And that's what's happening here. So electricity triggers the release of calcium. Calcium moves the chaperones, and then the proteins are like, let's do this. And they contract and they pull, right? So that is your, we already watched this video. That is your neuromuscular junction in a nutshell, right? Whew, right? So let's go through that whole process one last time, just to make it really clear. So acetylcholine will degrade, right? And that is what moves across. Acetylcholine is what triggers, if there's enough electricity running through a neuron, acetylcholine will get released. That triggers electricity to run across the muscle cell. When electricity runs across the muscle cell, it releases calcium into the fluid of that muscle cell, because all your cells are very fluid. And then calcium binds to the chaperones, they move out of the way, and then myosin grabs actin's binding sites and pulls it. And it grabs the next one and the next one, and it just pulls it towards the center. That happens over here, and it happens over here, and the whole thing slides, and the entire muscle cell shortens like this, right? They slide. That's why it's called the sliding filament theory, right? See how this protein is sliding across this protein here. And there's the whole thing. And then once it's done, ATP attaches, that flushes all the calcium out, puts the chaperones back in place, and the muscle relaxes back to full length. So speaking of actually, how are we doing so far, guys? Questions on any of that? I know that's really quite technical stuff. Feeling pretty good? I know some of you guys like Mir, David, Dion, Chris, you guys have heard this before, right? Edwin, you guys have been through this before. So hopefully it's a little clearer than last time. So for everybody who's new, if you're like, man, I don't feel like I got, it's going to come back around. Trust me, we're going to explain this and it'll be real clear by the time we're done with you. So last thing we're going to look at, we got two things to look at today. Let's talk about the types of muscular contraction. So let's zoom out, right? Let's get out of the cells, let's take a look at the muscle as a whole, right? So there's going to be 3 types of contractions that your muscles can make. And, they're all like various different versions of contractions, right? Now, when you think contraction, you're probably thinking, when I say like contract your muscle, you're probably thinking of this, right? Like squeezing your muscle to shorten the fibers, right? To cause the sliding in the sliding filament action. That's probably what you're thinking. But guess what? When your fibers relax and lengthen back out, that is also a contraction. Or when your fibers go like this, they maybe contract halfway and they just stay there. That is also a contraction. So there's 3 types of contractions. There are the classic contraction that you're thinking of, which is when a muscle fiber is shortening, like when you look at your biceps, it's always the best example because it's just easy to see here on camera. But like when you see a muscle fiber go from being like really long to bunching up and being really short, right? It's bunching up because the proteins are sliding across one another, they're stacking, right? So that's a concentric contraction. That's the classic contraction you're probably familiar with, right? It occurs when the muscle is developing a greater amount of tension inside of it than whatever force it's dealing with outside. Like right now, I don't have anything in my hand, right? So the only thing I have to deal with is gravity. That's easy, right? If I had like a 50-pound dumbbell, it could be a lot harder. So a concentric contraction is a contraction where the muscle's contracting for more force than whatever resistance, right? So when we're lifting weights, we are contracting, right? If I've got 100 pounds in my arms right now, right? If I generate more than 100 pounds of force, I'm going to lift that weight and I'm going to shorten the muscle fibers. They're going to slide across one another. Now, the exact opposite is true as well. In fact, when I go like this, my deltoid is shortening in order to drive itself up here. But my lats, the muscles underneath my arms, they're lengthening. They're getting pulled apart, right? In fact, when I squeezed my bicep, this shortened, but this muscle here, my tricep, it lengthened, right? But if I go this way, well, now my tricep is shortening and my bicep is lengthening. So every muscle in your body has an antagonist. Every muscle has an opposite. If I pull one, I got to lengthen the other on the opposite side of the bone. So like if I go like this side is shortening, this side is lengthening. And if I go this way, this side's lengthening and this side's shortening. So that's how we contract. You've got your antagonist muscle. Every muscle in the body Every muscle in the body has an opposite muscle because muscles can only pull. They cannot push. They can only pull and then relax, right? Now, I know that's confusing because it's like, I did push-ups this morning, right? Now, you did. We call it a push-up, but biologically, the muscles in your pec are pulling, and that's driving your arms this way. That's what's pushing you up away from the floor. And then we're lengthening and we're shortening, and we're lengthening and we're shortening. This is eccentric. This is concentric. Concentric is your classic contraction, right? It occurs when the muscle's shortening. Eccentric is the opposite. It occurs when a muscle is lengthening. It occurs when the muscle is developing less tension than whatever resistance you are dealing with. So if I've got like 100 pounds and I generate 110 pounds of force, I'm going to concentrically lift that weight. But if I generate 90 pounds of force, I'm going to eccentrically lower that weight. I'm going to lengthen my muscles, right? And then in the middle, you've got isometric contractions, okay? Isometric contractions occur when your muscles staying the same length. So like if you do a plank and you just hold yourself there, you're matching resistance, right? You're not lifting heavier and pulling yourself off the ground. You're not lifting too light and dropping towards the ground. You're just staying put, right? If you did a wall sit, right? Or you just hold the bottom of a squat, right? That's an isometric contraction, right? So concentric is shortening, eccentric is lengthening, isometric is just holding, right? So that's the difference between your three types of contractions. Biologically, we know the best way to create a whole bunch of cellular damage is to move between concentric and eccentric with no pausing in between. So literally lifting like this at about this tempo is the best way to build bigger muscles because it generates the most lactic acid. There's no time, your muscle fibers are being shortened and lengthened. It's like taffy, right? They're just pulling and shortening and pulling and shortening. You never stop. So you're creating the maximum cellular damage when you lift at like a medium tempo. Not too fast, not too slow, but no pauses. That'll make your muscles go poof and blow up and get big, right? Now, if you want your muscles to be strong, you want to go like this and then drop it back down. Now, that's not very good for getting big. I mean, it does because it makes more proteins, which is going to help you get big. But like if you're trying to get strong, you got to be explosive, right? Being explosive increases your power output. Okay. Now, if you want to have more endurance, we got to go slow and steady, and we got to do a bunch of reps. So we might lift like this, and we might even pause and get a little bit of isometric in there. And then nice and slow on the way down. And then we go back up, we hold it for just a second, nice and slow on the way down. That's a good way to build up your endurance. So type 1, type 2 muscle fibers. So let's talk about those muscle fibers. We're going to wrap up with this today. You got two major categories of muscle fibers, right? There's the one that produces a lot of energy kind of slowly, but like at least it produces a lot of energy very consistently. Those are your type 1 fibers. Type 1 fibers are known as your slow twitch oxidative fibers. We call them oxidative because they get a lot of oxygen. They have a lot of mitochondria. You have a lot of hemoglobin and myoglobin. All the stuff that carries oxygen, you get oxidative enzymes. All the stuff that carries oxygen, they're good at producing energy for like minutes at a time. When you think of a marathon runner, that is type 1 muscle, right? Or even just the muscle that's keeping you upright right now. It doesn't feel like you're using much muscle to sit upright, but like if you didn't use any muscle, it'd be like, you would just eventually like completely disappear. So you got to use at least a little bit. Well, you don't want to get tired while you're sitting upright. And so you have type 1 muscle fibers that don't have to contract very hard, but they can contract for really long durations of time. So they're muscle fibers that have a well-developed respiratory system. They bring in lots of oxygen, and they ensure the delivery of oxygen to the muscle. These tend to be a little bit smaller in size, but because even though they're smaller in size, they have way more mitochondria to produce lots and lots and lots of energy, slowly, but lots of energy. They have greater hemoglobin in their blood to carry oxygen around the body. They have greater myoglobin in the muscles to carry that oxygen from the blood throughout the muscle itself. And they're used for long-term endurance type contractions. Okay. Now, type 2 muscle fibers, which are probably the muscle fibers that most of you want. I don't know if I have any marathoners in here who are like, yeah, give me them type 1 muscles. But chances are everybody here is like, no, I want to tone up. I want to look good at the beach. You know, you're probably a little bit more focused on type 2 muscle fibers. Those are the larger muscle fibers. So type 2 fibers are your fast twitch muscle fibers. And these are muscle fibers that have a higher calcium level. They actually have more calcium in them and more cellular volume. So the cells are puffier, right? I said all your cells are very fluid. They have a lot of fluid inside of them. Well, type 2 muscles have even more fluid. They're just bigger and puffier and have more swampy area. That makes them really good at producing energy, not in the mitochondria, but in that fluid. We call that glycolysis, right? That's the sourdough bread sort of approach to energy production, right? So muscle fibers that have a higher calcium level and they have more cellular volume. They're much larger in size. They're way bigger. They don't have as much mitochondria, but they have more of the cellular volume, the cytoplasm, right? They have more fluid. You don't have as much hemoglobin in your blood because you don't really need it because you're not relying on oxygen. They don't have as much myoglobin. Again, you don't really need it. You don't have as much, you don't relying on oxygen, but there are going to be way more actin and myosin proteins. And that's the 2 ways you can grow your muscles. There's sort of a difference between, there's sort of 2 ways that you can grow your muscles, right? Like imagine here, I like this one better. Look at this, look at here, you can see like, here's a muscle cell, it's got 4 myofibrils in it, right? Now, you can make the cell puffier like this by shoving some more fluid into the cell, and that'll make it larger, right? We call that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Hypertrophy means muscle growth. Sarcoplasm is what we call the fluid, right? It's a version of cytoplasm within muscles. I don't know when it has to have a different name. But that's sarcoplasm, right? But the other thing you can do is you can also just make more of those rods, more of those proteins. So if you give your body a reason to need more energy and need more cellular fluid, it will make your cells puffier. And if you give your body a reason to need more proteins, need more rods, well, then it will make more rods, right? It will make more proteins within the muscle. So that means you need to have heavy lifting. You need to lift heavy to make more actin and myosin proteins and more cytoplasm, right? This is used for short-term, very powerful contractions. Now, I've been talking about the difference between type 1 and type 2. There actually are 2 types of type 2 muscle fibers. There's type 2A and type 2B or type 2X. They changed the name a couple of years ago. It was type 2B when I was in school, but now they're starting to call it type 2X. I guess they like X because it's like extreme. I don't know. But type 2A fibers are fast twitch, and we call them oxidative glycolytic fibers. Basically, type 2A is like halfway enduring, but halfway type 2. They're like kind of in the middle, right? They're big and puffy, which means they're large muscles, right? So they're very much like that sarcoplasmic muscular thing, right? And they have a pretty good amount of endurance, but not nearly as much endurance as like a type 1 muscle fiber. So they're kind of in the middle. This is usually what you're thinking of when you're thinking of like an athlete playing sports, right? When you think of like an athletic person, what do you need to be a professional athlete? You need to be strong and powerful, but you also need to have a pretty good amount of endurance, you know? That's like Shaq, right? Like Shaq was strong and powerful, but he would come back every season out of shape, right? And it drove Kobe crazy, who was strong and powerful, but he would also have like a lot of endurance. I would argue that that Shaq was what would be like a type 2X athlete, And I would say that Kobe was more of a type 2A athlete. Kobe was pretty strong, but he also had a lot of endurance. Shaq was just really, really, really strong, stronger than Kobe, right? He could probably lift more weight, but he didn't have as much endurance. He'd kind of, he'd always sucking wind and couldn't play as many minutes. So that's kind of the difference, right? Type 2A is usually what we think of when we think of like sports. Type 2X is like a full-on like Olympic powerlifting athlete. And it's like, you think about like, they're or like a power lifter, right? They're like, and I'm done. Like they do one rep and then they go take a nap for 500 years. Like that's a type 2X athlete, right? These are fast twitch glycolytic fibers, right? So we have fast twitch oxidative and fast twitch glycolytic. And they're the 2X is the true fast twitch fibers. That's extremely explosive. We think of like powerlifting or Olympic, like full on, like Usain Bolt would be type 2X. And then type 2A would maybe be like a soccer, or would be like, actually, you know what? Really good one, DK Metcalf, right? Remember DK Metcalf tried to like enter the Olympics because he had one of the fastest 40s for like a big guy. And he was like, I'm gonna try to be like in the Olympics as an Olympic sprinter. And when I heard that, I was like, I love you, DK. I'm a big fan. Ain't no way, like, because they're very different athletes. Football players need to have more endurance than track athletes who are sprinters. He was fast for a football player because he's competing against people who are type 2A athletes who are explosive, but also need to have endurance. But he wasn't as fast as a true type 2X athlete who is like, they sprint and then they rest and they rest and they rest and then they sprint. So because they train that way, they get way more explosive. And there's just a difference. They're just different athletes. I don't know which one's best. You guys might be hearing this and you're like, type 2A is the best. Somebody else might be like, yeah, I want to be a power lifter. Let's go type 2X, and somebody else might be listening to this and be like, I want a marathon. Let's go type 1. I don't think any of these are better than any of the others. They're all just different types of strength. And that is why we have to understand all this biology stuff, because like, oh Lord, physiologically, oh my God, I'm being attacked. What did I swallow? Oh my God, I'm dying. We got to understand all this physiology stuff, because at a cellular level, it's going to determine what type of athlete you are making. And if you got a client who says, I want to tone up, I want to lose some weight, and then you got them doing powerlifting, you're training them in a way that's not counterproductive to their goals, but it's not productive to their goals. Okay. So we'll, keep talking about that as we sort of move through the rest of this course. Now, you can modify your type fibers, by the way, just so you guys are aware. You can teach super explosive fibers to develop endurance over time. Like imagine going to the gym and lifting weights for the very, very, very first time. Maybe 10 pounds felt really heavy. So you were using what you had available to you, which was probably your type 2A or maybe even type 2X fibers at 10 pounds. Then you started doing it more and more. You started getting stronger, having more endurance. And then it's like, well, now I can lift 10 pounds for like 50 reps. And it's like, oh, okay, well, what used to be your type 2A or type 2X weight is now your type 1 weight. You want to keep getting stronger, you need to lift a heavier amount. And that's where you start to sort of develop your endurance through training. I remember in high school, I couldn't run a 6-minute mile, I didn't have the explosive power or the endurance. And now that's not really that daunting anymore, because that is something I trained for some time, right? I turned my endurance fibers strong and I turned my strong fibers endurance. You can train your body. It just, takes effort and time and a strategy and an understanding of physiology. If you're the trainer who's, writing the programs. And that's about it, guys. Any questions, any comments, any concerns? How's everybody feeling?
Doing great.
Cool. That was probably that was probably our biggest lesson today, I think, in this class. I think that'll be the longest, most technical. Well, we do have energy production. Energy production can also be it's just because you don't get to see the working parts. But I think today is probably the hardest lesson.
I feel like we're learning to be a doctor in here.
Nope. Just an advanced personal trainer. A lot of people think it's easy. It's just like, go lift some weights. But it's like, if you do that, that's a general approach. You're going to get general results. You want
because the way how you're explaining everything, I feel like we're starting to be a doctor with all the anatomy and stuff like that. What's next? How to disectomy?
Definitely not. Nope. I will be avoiding that. I love the bodies exhibit, but I am going nowhere near any of that. Cool. All right, guys. I'll kill the